to notice that on this particular activity, you're going to have a total of 6 different equations to do for each problem. Now, what I want to remind you of is each one of these problems, notice it's going to be very similar. I'm just adding one step to it each time to make it a little bit more difficult. I'm going to work out each one from top to bottom. So for instance, number one has 6 different problems that we'll do. And you can use those as an example to solve all the problems in number two, which are the same type of problem. In other words, the way I solved this one for number one is the same way that you'll solve this one for number two. The same way I solved this second one for number one is the same way you'll solve this second one for number two. So that way you can really practice on the process. So let me go ahead and I'm going to start with this first one. We're going to be using inverse operations. You do have to solve each problem in order to get credit. You must use inverse operations, so we're not using numerical solve anymore, and you have to show all your work. So just keep that in mind as you're going through this. To get credit, you will have to show all your work and solve each one of these. Now, I'm going to start the way I always do. I'm going to go ahead and draw a line through my equal sign. Now, once I draw that line, it just helps me keep each side of the equation balanced. I'm going to go ahead and take this 3x right here, right? And I need to do something to it to get rid of the 3, because our goal is to have just a single x variable, or whatever variable we have. It's just we want one variable with a coefficient of 1. So the way I get rid of this 3 is I have to divide by that number that's in front of the x. So I'm going to divide it by 3. And if I divide the left side by 3, I have to divide the right side by 3. Now, if I go to my calculator, if you're not sure, well, how many times can 3 go into 3, right? We can always go to our calculator real quick. And if I were to take my calculator and hit Control Divide to get a fraction bar and put 3 over 3, and I hit Enter, it would give me 1. And that's my goal, is to get x to be 1. So by dividing this out, it leaves me with just 1x. So I'm going to come right back over here. We like to say these cancel out, but really they just give us 1. So therefore we have 1x left over. And that's going to be equal to this 9 divided by this 3. So once again, I'm just going to go back to my calculator, and I'm going to get my fraction bar, Control Divide, and I'm going to put 9 over 3. And I'm going to hit Enter, and notice that gives me 3. And that's the answer to my first problem. So I'm going to come back to it, and 3 will go into 9 3 times. And I'm done with this first problem. So next, I'm going to go ahead and go to the second one. So on this second one, we're going to start it the same way. I'm going to draw my line through my equal sign. The only difference is, instead of just having 3x, we have a 12 over here. So we need to move this 12, this constant value, over to the other side of the equation before we can divide out our 3. So the way I do that is always by doing the opposite of whatever is occurring. In other words, right here, we're adding 12, right? Plus 12. So we're going to do the opposite, which is going to be to subtract 12. So instead of adding, I'm going to put minus 12. And 12 minus 12 is going to give me 0. And if you're not sure about that, right, we could always go to the calculator. 12 minus 12 is 0. So every time that you're solving one of these, just keep in mind that anytime we subtract or we add a number that is the same, then what's going to happen is it's going to cancel out. So that gives me 0. So I'm going to say these cancel. Now, all I have left, right, is the 3x on the left. But what I have to do is I have to remember, if I subtracted 12 from the left side, I also have to subtract 12 from the right. So now I have 9 minus 12. So whenever I get what that is, I'm going to write it down. So I am going to put this in my calculator, 9 minus 12. And I have 9 minus 12. And that gives me negative 3. So I'm going to write that down. Now at this point, I'm going to write that down in black, negative 3. I'm going to keep my variable over here, pink. So I'm just bringing it down. We still have 3x. And we're not done. But the situation we're in now is similar to what we started out with up here, where we just had 3x equals 9. Well, now we have 3x equals negative 3. So if I want to get rid of this 3, I'm going to have to divide by that number in front of x. So I'm going to divide both sides by positive 3 because that's a positive 3. We know 3 going to itself one time because we tested that with the calculator up here. We said 3 going to 3 one time, which leaves us with 1x. So this means this leaves us with just 1x. And that's equal to whatever negative 3 over 3 is. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in my calculator real quick. So if I have 3 over negative 3, that's going to give me negative 1. So my answer to this problem is negative 1. X is equal to negative 1. Now let's go to the next problem. It's going to be very similar to this one. So on this one, while it's very similar, the process is almost the same. I want you to notice that not only do we have the 3x plus 12, just like the first one, and we have the 9, just like that second one. Now we've added another x. So this creates an extra step that we have to do. But most of the steps are going to be the same. Just to give you an example, and I'm going to use my black pen for the constants now since we have them on both sides, and my pink pen will be just for the variables. So if I come over here, I still have this positive 12. I'm going to start it the same way. I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. And I'm subtracting because it's a positive 12. So I'm going to subtract it over here. Now 12 minus 12, we already know that's 0, so I'm going to cancel it out, right? If I go back to my calculator, 12 minus 12 gives me 0. So I'm going to say they're canceled out. They became a 0 set. Now I have 9 minus 12. So I'm going to go back to my calculator. And I'm going to say, well, 9 minus 12. And that gives me negative 3. So nothing's changed so far. We're looking pretty much at the same value we got previously. But now I have to deal with this 6x because I want all my x's on the left. And I'm going to write a note right here. And I want you to write this down too. X on left. And then right here, I want you to put a number sign. Numbers on right. So our goal today, we want all the x's on the left and we want all the numbers on the right. So what we have to do, we have to get rid of this 6x that's on the right. We got to move it to the left. Now this is a positive 6x, and the reason I know is because there's no negative sign in front of it. So I'm going to do the opposite of a positive 6x, which is a negative 6x. And I'm going to subtract it. Now, while we cannot subtract x's inside of our calculator, we can subtract the number in front of the x to let us know how many x's we have left. And I can tell you that 6x minus 6x is going to be 0 because they're the same number. We have a positive and a negative, so they become 0. But I also have to subtract 6x over here. And this one's not going to be 0 because they're not the same number, right? This one has a coefficient of 3. This one has a coefficient of 6. So I'm going to ignore the x and just put in my calculator 3 minus 6. And that's going to tell me how many x's I have left on this left side. And then I'll write that number right in front of this x. So 3 minus 6, let me go to my calculator. 3 minus 6. And that's going to give me negative 3. So I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to say, okay, so this is negative 3x. So right now what we have left is negative 3x on one side of the equation, and we have negative 3 on the other side. My last step is to go ahead and divide by this negative 3. I want to divide by my coefficient. In other words, I want to divide by this number in front of x so that I can change this x's coefficient to 1. So that's a negative 3, so we'll divide by negative 3. And negative 3 going to negative 3 one time, leaving me with just this x. And that's going to be equal to whatever. Let's see, we have a negative 3 right here. So let me divide that. So what we're doing at this point is we are dividing right here this negative 3 by negative 3. And then we're going to write our answer down there. So let me come over here and I'm going to go ahead and say negative 3 divided by negative 3. Let me put my negative sign right in front of here. Get rid of this other one. There it goes. Negative 3 divided by negative 3. And that gives me positive 1. So I'm going to come back over here. And so my answer to this one is actually positive 1. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. And now we're going to move to a problem that's just a little bit more difficult. We got a few extra steps, but it's very similar. So I'm going to move this down a little bit so you can see it. So I want you to notice that on this next problem, just like we had 3x plus 12, well, now we have 3, and we have an x in parentheses plus a 4 in parentheses. And on this right side, we had 6x plus 9. And on this right side, we still have 6x plus 9. So some of it's changed a little bit because now we have to distribute this 3. But the rest of this is the same. Now, when we distribute, I want you to remember you're going to take the number that's on the outside of the parenthesis. For instance, we're going to take this 3 right here, and we're going to multiply it to the number inside the parenthesis. In other words, at first, I am going to multiply it to this x right here, and I'm going to draw an arrow pointing to it. And so what I have right here is I actually have 3 times x. And if I put that together, I'm going to put a little arrow, it gives me 3x. Now, the next step is I need to multiply it to the second number inside of the parenthesis. So I'm going to multiply it to this 4 right here. So I'm going to draw an arrow. That means I'm multiplying. So 3 times 4. And whatever the answer is, I'm going to bring it down here and write it. So 3 times this 4, and that's what I'm writing, 3 times 4. I'm going to put that in my calculator. 3 times 4, and it gives me 12. So I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to write right there plus 12. I am going to bring down my equal sign, and I'm going to bring down my 6x, although I'm going to write it in pink, right, because this 6x is actually a variable. And I'm going to bring down my positive 9. So at this point, I want you to notice we're ready for the next steps. Now it's just a regular equation, right? I can go and draw my line in between it, kind of light pink line right there, so I can keep my equation balanced. And my goal is to move the 12 to the right and move the 6 to the left. So I'm going to move this 12 to the right by subtracting, because currently it's adding, so I need to do the opposite. And I know that 12 minus 12 is 0, so they're going to cancel out. I am then going to subtract the 12 from this right side. And on that one, 9 minus 12, right, we can just go to our calculator. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to say, well, 9 minus 12, and that gives me negative 3. So I'll come back, and I'll write, okay, so this, I'm going to bring it down just a little bit, is going to be a negative 3. Now, my next goal is to get all the x's on the left. So I have to move this 6x over to the left. The way I do that, because this is a positive 6x, is I'm going to go ahead and subtract 6x. Now I know that 6x minus 6x gives me 0 x's. So I'm just going to cross it out. It's canceled. But I got to remember to also subtract 6x from the left. Now this is going to give me some value of x. However, I don't know what it is, right? I just know that it's going to be 3x's minus 6x's. So in my calculator, to do the math, I'm just going to subtract the number in front of the x and then write it down here, and it'll tell me how many x's I have. So 3 minus 6. So 3 minus 6. And that's going to give me negative 3. So I'm going to come back over here, and this is negative 3. And now all I have left is negative 3x's on the left and negative 3 on the right. So now what I want to do is I need to divide by this negative 3, which is the coefficient of x, so that I can get x to just be 1x. Now if I divide on the left, I also have to divide on the right. And what I end up with is negative 3 going to negative 3 one time. So that just leaves me with 1x. And that's going to be equal to whatever negative 3 divided by negative 3 is. So if I go back to my calculator, negative 3 divided by negative 3. You know what? And once again, I shouldn't have put that sign there. There it goes. Negative 3 divided by negative 3. And it gives me positive 1. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to write positive 1. And that's my answer to this equation. So we're almost done. We just have two more equations left to do. So let's take a look at the next one, because it's going to get just a little bit more difficult. Not much, but a little bit. So I want you to notice on this next one down here, it starts out just like this one, 3x plus 4. So we got 3x plus 4. So that's no big deal, right? We've already done that up here. So we're just going to do it again down here. But now, instead of it being 6x plus 9, we have to distribute this 2 to the 3x and to the 4.5. So let's go ahead and do that. So first, we're always going to start this problem by distributing that number that is in front of the parenthesis. And on this case, we'll have to do it 2 times. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and multiply this 3 times x. In other words, it's 3 times x. And that's going to give me, I'm just going to make this little arrow, 3 x's. I am now going to multiply this 3 times the 4. So 3 times 4. And whatever it gives me, I'm going to write right underneath that arrow right there. So I'm going to come back to my calculator, 3 times 4, and that gives me 12. So I'm going to write plus 12, because it's a positive 12. If it would have said minus 12, I'd put minus 12. But it said 12, so that's plus 12. I'm going to bring down my equal sign. And now we have to distribute this 2 to the 3x. So in other words, we have 2 times 3x. And then I'm going to write my answer below. Now, I know some of you are looking at it going, well, Mr. H, this 2 doesn't have an x, but this 3 does. Well, okay, when that happens, it's really easy. You know that you're going to end up with an x because we can't get rid of the x. We're just going to write it down here. And then we just have to multiply the number part. In other words, the coefficient, which is 3, we got to multiply it by 2. And whatever that gives us, we write right in front of the x. So if I go to my calculator and I go, well, 2 times 3, it gives me 6. So I'm going to come back, and this is going to be 6x. But now I got to take that same 2 and multiply it to this 4.5. So 2 times 4.5. I'm going to multiply that out, and I'm going to write my answer right beneath it. So let me come back. So I have 2 times 4.5. I'm going to hit enter, and it gives me 9. So I'm going to come back, and I'm going to go ahead and write plus 9. Now, at this point, I have a regular equation, right? We can solve it from this point. I'm going to draw my line through the center of the equal sign so I can be sure to keep it balanced. And we want to move all our x's to the left and all our constants to the right. So if I want to move this 12 to the right, I'm going to do the opposite of adding 12, which is subtracting. So those cancel out, become a 0 set. I'm also going to subtract 12 from the right. And if you're not sure what that is, we can do 9 minus 12 in our calculator. 9 minus 12, and it gives me negative 3. So I'm going to write right here, negative 3. I then want to move this 6x to the left. So I got to do the opposite of a positive 6x, which is going to be subtracting 6x. That becomes a 0 set. And then I got to subtract that 6x from the left. And in this case, right, we're just going to write our x down, and then we're going to do our subtraction in our calculator. 3 minus 6. So 3 minus 6. That's going to give me negative 3. So I'm going to write negative 3 right here. And now we just have 3x, negative 3x. And on the other side of the equation, negative 3. Now remember, this line right here represents an equal sign. So I need to go ahead and get this coefficient to change to be a coefficient of 1. So I'm going to divide by the number that's in front of the x. In this case, it happens to be a negative 3 again. So I know when I divide any number by itself, it just becomes positive 1. So I have 1x left over. And over here, negative 3 divided by negative 3, I can go to my calculator, put that in, and say negative 3 divided by negative 3, and it gives me a positive 1. So now you know how to solve one that's actually more difficult. So let's go ahead and let's go to the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move this down a little bit. Here's your last problem. And once we finish this one, you'll be ready to do all the problems for number 2 because you're going to use the same process. So on this one, I want you to notice that instead of a number in front of the parenthesis, we got a negative sign. So we're still going to treat it like a number. I just need you to remember that there is an imaginary 1 in front, or I'm sorry, in front of the parenthesis, in between the negative sign and parenthesis. So I want you to write yourself a note here. And I want you to put, or actually, let's say not imaginary, let's say invisible. Invisible 1. And draw you an arrow. So remember that there is an invisible 1 in front of this negative sign. In other words, I could draw it in with my pen if I wanted to. There's a 1 right there. So I'm going to take that negative 1 and multiply it to negative 3x. In other words, I have negative 1 times negative 3x. Now, when I get the answer to this, I'm just going to write it down here at the bottom. So I'm going to go to get my calculator, and why I cannot multiply the negative 1, I'm not necessarily multiplying it to the x. In other words, the x isn't going to change. I can multiply the negative 1 and the negative 3 in my calculator and see what it gives me. So if I do negative 1 times negative 3 and I hit enter, notice it gives me a positive 3. So I'm going to go ahead and write that positive 3 in front of it. So this went from negative 1 times negative 3 to a positive 3x. Now I do have to multiply this negative to this 4 as well. So it's going to be multiplied to this negative 4. So now I have negative 1 times negative 4. And whenever I get my answer, I'm going to write it down here. So let me go ahead and do that right quick. So if I come back to my calculator and I say, well, negative 1 times negative 4, and hit enter, and that gives me positive 4. So I'm going to come back, and I'm going to go ahead and write a positive 4, which means I put a plus sign in between. Okay, so we're almost done. But now we notice that this next one over here, I'm going to highlight that one in pink, we also have a negative sign on this side. So in other words, we have another 1 in front of there. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to multiply this negative 1 to that negative 6. So let me write my equal sign here because we have an equal sign. Right there, that equal sign is right there. And then negative 1 times negative 6. So negative 1 times negative 6x. And once again, I'm going to bring down the x, and I'm just going to multiply the negative 1 and the negative 6 in my calculator. That'll show me what I get. So I have negative 1 times negative 6, and it gives me positive 6. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down right here. So that is a positive 6. Next, I have to take this negative 1 and then multiply it to the negative 9. So negative 1 times negative 9. And we're going to write our answer down there. Now, some of you may be looking at going, Mr. H, I know how to multiply integers. I know how to change the sign, but that's okay, right? If you're not sure or if it's confusing to you, just use the calculator. So negative 1 times negative 9, and that's going to give me positive 9. So I'm going to write that down. So I have positive 9. Okay, so now we're ready to solve this, right? We took care of our invisible 1. We distributed that negative sign to both terms on the inside. Notice it did change it, right? In other words, this one was negative 3x minus 4, and it changed it to positive 3x plus 4. This one was negative 6x minus 9, but when we distribute that negative sign to both terms, it becomes positive 6x plus 9. Now we're ready to solve this. We're going to treat it just like our regular old equation. I'm going to draw a line through my equal sign so I can be sure to keep both sides of the equation balanced. Whatever I do to the left, I must do to the right. So let me start out. I want to move all my constant values, in other words, the ones in black, the numbers, to the right side, and I want to move all my variables, the ones in pink, over to the left side. So I'm going to start by moving this 4 over to the right. So that's a positive 4. So I'm going to do the opposite of whatever I see. If this was subtraction, I would add. Since it's addition, I'm going to subtract. And those cancel out, right? 4 minus 4 is 0. So that cancels. I'm also going to subtract 4 from this side. But this one's not going to give me 0 because that's not a 4. So I'm going to put that in my calculator. 9 minus 4. 9 minus 4. And that gives me 5. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to write a 5 right here. And now I want to move this 6x over to the left. So I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite of a positive 6x, which is subtract 6x. Now this is going to cancel out, right? Because anything minus itself is 0. Then I got to subtract 6x over here. This one's not going to cancel out. We will have an x left over, but I don't know how much. So we're going to put this in the calculator. 3 minus 6. So notice I'm just subtracting the coefficients, because if you put an x in there, it's going to give you an error. And it gives me negative 3. So I'm going to come back to it, and this is going to be negative 3. So we have negative 3x is equal to positive 5. So our final step is to get rid of this coefficient of negative 3. The way we do that is we divide by that number. And it doesn't matter what number it is. We always divide by the number and its sign to get x by itself, isolated. And if I divide by negative 3, it just leaves me with simply 1x. And over here, I have 5, and I got to divide that by a negative 3. So what I need to do here with this answer is, before I write it as my answer, I need to see, can it be simplified? And the way I can check to see if it can be simplified is by putting it in the calculator. The calculator will automatically simplify any fraction. So I'm going to put on there my fraction bar, and then 5 over negative 3. I'll hit enter. If it stays the same, then I'll write it as my final answer. If it changes, then I have to write the new answer it gives me. And in this case, it stayed the same. So it's just negative 5 over 3. So I'm going to go ahead and write that as my answer. Negative 5 over 3. And you are done with this problem. Now the problems on the right side, you will solve in the same manner, following the same process. Your problems might be spread out a little further because I tried to give you some extra room to be able to solve these problems, but the process is exactly the same. Watch this video for whatever problem it is you get stuck on, and so you can see a similar problem and how you would work it out. If you have any questions, ask me in the classroom, and I'll also be more than happy to help you.